roads getting safer. The ITF has done groundbreaking work on this via our corporate partnership board. We released our first report in 2020 on safe micromobility. We've done an upgrade, a reboot of that report in 2024 called Safer Micromobility. This is due to much more data becoming available in the last 4 years to inform us. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sharon Masterson, who's the manager of our corporate partnership board. That's our mechanism for engaging with the private sector. And Philippe Crist, who's the lead author and expert on micromobility at the ITF. Over to you, Sharon.
Thank you very much, Ronan, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us this morning. I know you've had a busy morning already, so we're very much looking forward to presenting the work that we've done with our corporate partners and also eagerly awaiting your questions, and especially the difficult ones. So we're looking forward to those. My name is Sharon Masterson, as Ronan said. I manage the Corporate Partnership Board at the International Transport Forum. Just a little bit about the Corporate Partnership Board. It is our platform for engaging with the corporate sector at the ITF because we understand the value that the insights from the private sector will bring to the work that we do. We set it up 10 years ago, and since we have done a number of different publications and pieces of work with our corporate partners, including on shared mobility, including on governance of data, artificial intelligence, and a number of different projects, including these ones this year, on normalizing CO2 reporting and decarbonising aviation. So these are the members of our corporate partnership board, and I'd like to thank them because they have made this work possible from the beginning for the last 10 years and made this work available to the broader transport community. So you can see we have a mix of members from within transport, but also aligned to transport. For example, the IT industry, the energy industry, and the insurance industry, all of which are important for the topics that we're going to discuss today. I'd like to hand you over to my colleague Philippe Crist, who has led the micromobility work in the past, Safe Micromobility, the work that we launched, the publication that we launched in 2020, just ahead of the lockdown for COVID, in Stockholm at the 3rd Ministerial Conference. And as Ronan mentioned just earlier, since that, a lot of things have changed in the micromobility world. We have a lot more data, and we really felt the need to update the publication that we released. So I'll hand it over to Philippe to talk about this publication now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and thank you all for coming today. The questions that we addressed in this work were around the safety of micromobility, but let's start with micromobility itself. We believe that the micromobility small vehicles can contribute to better outcomes in urban areas, but not just in urban areas, in towns and villages as well. They have a clear role to play, especially in conjunction with public transport, but they must be safe like any transport mode. And so this is something that both at the regional level around our membership and at the national level is a key concern. Is micromobility becoming safer? And how can we contribute to it becoming safer? Now, when we talk about micromobility, we talk about a range of vehicle types. And the way in which we classify micromobility at the ITF is to start from the safety perspective, the safe system approach. And in that approach, we identify 2 variables that really matter in terms of safety. And one is vehicle mass, and the other one is vehicle speed. And so when we talk about micromobility, we're talking about vehicles that are either up to 35 kilos in weight or from 35 kilos in weight to 350 kilos in weight. And so this might encompass some of the larger pedal-assisted freight delivery bicycles that you might see in some of your cities. And at the same time, we talk about 2 speed bands, vehicles that can travel up to 25 kilometers an hour, especially when they're assisted with an electric motor, and vehicles that can travel up to 45 kilometers an hour. Now, in this work, we're talking about the kind of micromobility that is most seen in most of our member countries, and that's going to be type A micromobility, so vehicles that weigh less than 35 kilos and travel up to 25 kilometers an hour with electric assistance, and type C vehicles, that have the same weight but can travel up to 45 kilometers an hour under their assisted mode. As Sharon said, we are continuing this work on work that we had already undertaken in 2020. In 2020, if you recall, it was only 3 years after the first commercial introduction of shared e-scooter services in North America. And in that time, in the 3 years that ensued, we saw a tremendous uptake of shared e-scooter services. At the same time, we had existing shared bicycle services. And of course, for a long time, for almost more than 100 years, we have had bicycles in our cities. And so we had a very divergent evidence on, or very diverse rather, evidence on the safety performance of all of these modes. When we looked at this first report, the work that we did for this first report, we only had 3 years of shared e-scooter data. And so some of the findings that came out of that were, of course, communicated at the Global Ministerial Conference on Road Safety in Stockholm in 2020. But we knew that we were going to have to revisit this quite soon. And this is what this work has done. We have 3 key messages that come from this work, and then I'll dive down a bit into some of the specific findings. And the first one is that micromobility, as far as we have evidence to support and evidence that is available, is becoming safer. And that's in particular the case for shared micromobility. And why that is because we have excellent data on both the rate of use of shared micromobility and the number of incidents involving crashes and injuries for shared micromobility. But what we do see is a worrying incidence in a number of serious e-scooter crashes. And I'll go into the characterization of those crashes later. So there is some real need to focus on making sure that these services, both when they're shared in a commercial operation or when they're used by individuals, are safe. And we have some specific recommendations on that. We see that from a public policy perspective, infrastructure really does matter. Having smooth, safe, coherent, comfortable infrastructure that allows the safe use of bicycles, e-bicycles, and e-scooters is necessary. And that is, of course, the role of public authorities to provide that. But vehicle design also matters, especially for some of the newer form factors that we see. Standing e-scooters, sitting e-scooters, some of these factors that weren't at all in engineers' minds when they're thinking about putting in place the kind of infrastructure that we are familiar with in many of our cities. And the last thing, which is a optimistic finding, is that, in fact, a lot of the things that we're already doing to improve road safety will improve micromobility safety, and particularly looking at managing speed, looking at providing training for users, looking at enforcing rules against impaired riding and impaired driving of cars and vans helps improve micromobility safety. And, oops, if I can ask you to go back one slide, because there you go. How do we assess micromobility safety? Now, of course, if we're worried about crashes, if you can go forward one slide, please. Yeah, there. If we are worried about crashes, it's because crashes lead to injuries, and injuries, of course, have a negative impact on health. So health is really our starting point, and I'll explain why that is, because there are both positive impacts to health and negative impacts to health, as I said, from crashes. From that health perspective, we look at the safety aspect. So this is where injuries come into play. And the injuries result from crashes, and we, in this work, look at what are the crash causal factors. We isolate and identify 3 types of factors that contribute to crashes. One, infrastructure. The second one are the users, the riders that are using these devices. And the last one are the vehicles. And there's this overarching factor as well, which is the performance of and the safety performance of other vehicles in the traffic system, cars and vans in particular. And all these contribute to how and to what extent we believe that micromobility is safe and healthy in contributing to health outcomes or not. If I can ask you to contribute. Yep. In talking about health, As I said, there are positive aspects that come from physical activity. So some forms of micromobility, cycling and e-cycling, are proven to have positive health benefits that come from physical activity itself. And we also have the passive forms of micromobility. And so these are going to be the forms where you're standing and not actually contributing to any kind of physical activity to use the device. And this is the case with e-scooters. There is a clear difference from a policy perspective between active micromobility and passive micromobility. It's an important one to keep in mind, because if we put in place policies that depress the number of people using active modes to get around, then there's an overall societal negative impact that comes from reduced health from people using these active modes. When we look at the data that we have available to us, we try to look at the actual risk, not just the number of incidents. And so we try to understand what are the volume of trips on the one hand, and what are the number of crashes or injuries that are taking place, so that we can normalize that to a per kilometer crash risk. When we look at shared e-scooter crash risk in Europe, where we have excellent data both on the number of trips and the types of serious and fatal injuries, we see that there's been a 26% reduction in crash risk from 2022 to 2021. The Micromobility for Europe, which is the industry association, just came out with their updated figures last week, and they showed that this tendency has continued, a decrease in crash risk. One thing to keep in mind is that we do not have very good data on private micromobility, either bicycle trips, although we have better data than we do for e-scooter trips. And that's important because the number of devices, the number of vehicles that are being used by individuals is quite significant and growing. To give an example, in France in 2021, there were about 40,000, a fleet of about 40,000 shared e-scooters available for people. That same year, almost 1 million private e-scooters were sold. And so there are a lot of these devices for which we don't have trip data. And so the caveat here is that we have this information on shared e-scooters, and governments, public authorities need to improve their data collection to have a better view of overall micromobility. And one of the things that is sometimes hard to explain, and that is that I think the battery is dead on this. Can you go back one slide, please? One of the things that is sometimes difficult to explain is that you might see the number of crashes go up, but at the same time, crash risk goes down. And why that is because there's simply more trips taking place. And so arithmetically, there are a number of trips that are going up faster than the number of crashes. And that's certainly something that we have seen in the past with cycling, when cycling starts becoming more popular. And it's something that we start to see when we have data on overall micromobility. That means that even though these crashes are going up, it may mean that there is a positive outcome. But what it also means is that public authorities and the industry need to focus on reducing serious crashes and, of course, fatal crashes. If we can go to the next slide, please. And I'm just going to ask you to advance the slides. So in this slide, what can we say about micromobility crashes? Well, most of the micromobility crashes, be they cycling or e-scooter crashes, result in minor injuries. And a lot of these don't result in serious injuries. And that's particularly the case for fatal injuries. There aren't a significant share of these crashes that are fatal. And from what we can tell in the shared micromobility data, that those fatal injuries are decreasing. What we also see is that there are a lot of self-crashes, so crashes from e-scooter riders, cyclists, and e-cyclists that don't involve another road user, so people losing control, running into obstacles, and falling off. But what we do see is that the most dangerous outcomes, the fatal outcomes, are almost always involving a car, a van, or a truck. So the danger in the urban traffic system isn't from the use of these devices, it's from the presence of these vehicles next to large, fast, and heavy vehicles. And that's something that we know in the safe system approach is something that must be addressed by separating and by managing speed in the system to reduce that kind of crash risk. Next slide, please. When we look at specific injuries, especially for e-scooter and bicycle crashes, we see that they are different in nature. E-scooter crashes have a greater share of head injuries, and especially face and lower jaw injuries, whereas cyclists have less of an incidence of these types of injuries. One of the things that we can also see is that helmet use among cyclists is generally higher than for e-scooters. We also see that there's a higher incidence of alcohol-involved crashes for e-scooters, and that might also help explain the differences. And we also see a higher prevalence of higher injuries for lower extremities, and this may be because people are hopping off of e-scooters in a crash situation where they've lost control. Next slide, please. Infrastructure matters. It contributes 30 to 40% of all e-scooter crashes, and part of that is linked to the inherent instability of some of the early designs of e-scooters, especially with small front wheels. That makes loss of control easier, and I'll touch on that when we talk about the design of the vehicles themselves. Next slide, please. When we look at riders, we see that, especially for e-scooters, that nighttime riding, riding and reduced lighting is a significant crash factor, and this is especially the case after late hours. And that's combined with alcohol impairment as well, because e-scooters are often used to get around, thankfully, when some of the riders cannot drive or should not drive. We also see, as I said, a lower incidence of helmet wearing, and that's even in the case where helmets are mandatory. Across most of our membership, helmets are not mandatory, but we do see that e-scooter riders generally wear helmets less than cyclists. One of the things coming from that finding that many of the e-scooter crashes involve the face and the lower jaw is that helmets that are designed for cycling and for e-bikes may not be sufficiently or may not provide sufficient protection for the kinds of crashes that we see with e-scooters, which are generally over the handlebar or forward obstacle crashes landing on your face. Tandem riding, so riding 2 or 3 people, are a significant contributor or a significant correlated factor for crashes. Even though we see where this is counted, about 2 to 5% of all trips involve double or triple riding. Those types of trips contribute to about 17% of scooter-related injuries. And of course, inexperienced riding is also a factor, especially for e-scooters, since these are new vehicles that people aren't trained to use from childhood on. That may be changing. There may be a age cohort effect. We also see it for e-bikes, for people who are riding a bicycle for the first time, but using an e-bike, and there are some training issues with experience there. Next slide, please. In terms of the vehicles, we see that e-scooters, bicycles, and e-bikes, of course, also have very different characteristics. They look very different. Next slide, please. And in particular, we see these are some of the safety-related differences. So the head height on an e-scooter is higher than on most bicycles, so that means the distance to fall to the ground is higher and acceleration is higher. The center of gravity is higher and more forward placed on e-scooters than on bicycles. That means in an obstacle, then the center of gravity will displace over the handlebars. There are these vaulting kind of injuries that lead to these face injuries. The early forms of shared vehicles and some of the current available individual e-scooters have braking systems that are not on par with cycling, so with a single front brake or a single brake system for both front and rear. The steering column is higher. That means that in e-scooter frontal crashes, it serves as a fulcrum, so leveraging the rider over the front. The wheel size is smaller, very much smaller in some of the early models. That means that loss of stability control is easier, and a rock or a slight obstacle can shift the weight of the rider and off. Acceleration is throttle acceleration, so it's basically a thumb, and that is much more sudden in some of the models than with assisted acceleration for most e-bikes. That is going to be related to the pedaling action, is a little more smooth. And finally, the platform on early models of e-scooters are more narrow. That makes riding a little more unstable. What we can say is for shared e-scooter fleets, almost all of these vulnerabilities have been addressed. And the latest models of shared e-scooters take into account some of these with weight that's being put further down and further back, with dual braking systems, with a steering column that is adjusted a bit forward, a bit at a slacker angle to prevent this vaulting, with the front tire size, the front wheel size that's larger, so it enables it to roll over obstacles. And because these fleets are rapidly renewed, we see the penetration of those vehicles leading to some of the effects that we see in terms of the safety outcomes. Finally, and I'm not going to go over all this list, next slide, we have a number of specific recommendations for authorities and for operators of shared services. But for the authorities, most of our recommendations relate to the things that, of course, they have a responsibility for. That's going to be infrastructure, parking provision, training. So one of the things is that as people in many countries are exposed to bicycle training in lower school, they should also be exposed to scooter training and e-scooter training in particular. There are some issues that are more at the national level on technical design and homologation of some of these vehicles. And data collection, as I said, there's a real need for better data collection on the part of authorities, especially on the number of users of these types of vehicles, not just those that are using the shared services, but also on the types of crashes that involve these vehicles. And this goes in line with some of the recommendations that we've done in the past in terms of collecting information, precise information on road crashes. Now, for operators, a lot of our recommendations are more on how they can incentivize safe riding, how they can even further increase the deployment of safer vehicles involving some of the most recent safety technology, including the prevention of dual riding, for example, and the ways in which they can also monitor their fleets for crashes. So again, many, many recommendations, but you can find all of these, next slide please, on the website that this QR code links to. What you'll also find there is that there is a fairly extensive technical report. So the report that I've presented here is a summary report of sorts, but there's an extensive technical report that's available to you as well. And the last thing I'll say on this is we're just about to release a companion piece that's going to be looking at the life cycle assessment of micromobility, updating again work that we did about 3 to 4 years ago. So with that, I'll close and I'll look forward to answering your questions as best that I can.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And I'd also like to mention that this part of work is part of a broad base of work that we do at the ITF on road safety. So we have a huge history in road safety, dating back since the 1950s, and you'll find all of that work, including the work of our working group, IRTAD and data on our website. So just to highlight that also. We'll take questions if anyone has any questions or comments. Yes? Maybe you can introduce yourself as well.
I'm Ashok Purohit from Times of Oman, Sultanate of Oman. I was just wondering, it's a fantastic study what you have done, and you did say that the percentage of crashes at individual basis can't be accounted. How could the government introduce a legislation, or whether your recommendations would go to the ministerial body, and whether the member nations of ITF would be bound by any of these recommendations that you have made?
As I said in the very opening, one of the key things that comes out of this study is things that many governments are already doing, help contribute to the safety of micromobility. So look in any city where there's a lot of cycling, where there's a lot of e-scooter use, and ask anyone looking at that, what is the most dangerous vehicle there? People would probably say, oh, it's the e-scooter, it's the latest vehicle, and it's really dangerous and we need to get it off the road, and certainly we need to get it off the sidewalk where it's parked. But in fact, as I said, the most dangerous vehicle in that environment are cars, vans, and trucks. And the main thing that governments can do in urban settings where there's a lot of use of that shared space is to reduce traffic speeds to a safe level. And so that is fully consistent with the safe system approach. And that is something that governments can enable when they don't have direct control over what urban speeds are set. So they can enable it so that urban governments can say, then for these areas, we want 30 kilometers, and these areas, we want 20 kilometers. That's the first thing. The second thing is they can enable national governments, I'm talking about here. National governments can enable the possibility to provide infrastructure for these types of light mobility devices. And of course, here we're talking about e-scooters and bicycles, but we've done other work also at the ITF looking at anything that's smaller than car and how, not just in the developed world, but also in the global south, these are vehicles that provide a lot of value, but need space. And so providing that safe, coherent, comfortable, fit-for-purpose space is something that, again, national governments can enable, but that local authorities, regional authorities can put into place. And we have seen that after COVID with the rapid repurposing of public space, going back to another bit of work that we did with the Corporate Partnership Board, looking at streets that fit. It's the name of another report. How can we provide that space in these dense areas? So from a national perspective, allowing safe speeds to be set and helping infrastructure be set. But then there's this final piece on vehicle design. And that is something that is usually at the national level, homologation or the kind of standards that set what kind of vehicles can be used on public roads. And there I think it's really important to focus on some of the things we've talked about. The crash risk inherent in the design of e-scooters, whether or not you want to allow e-scooters that can go up to 45 kilometers an hour. Ireland just released their national rules on e-scooter use, and they do not allow those scooters. In France and other countries, they do allow those scooters, but they're regulated as light motorcycles, as mopeds. And then some specific designs on the wheel size, platform, weight. All of those are the purview of national governments, or at least national standards. And so that's the third area where governments can intervene to improve the safety of these vehicles. And training, as I said, there's school training, incorporating e-scooter training also in the school curriculum when you're also looking at bicycle safety.
Just on that, our role is really to get it on the agenda, so that we have something ready for them when they start looking at this project, when they start looking at these questions. And that's very important, that we inform them ahead of important decisions being taken. And a lot of our work has been used by the governments, and we're there available to help them and to answer their questions as well. But really to get it upstream before they take those decisions, I think that's important, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Amanda. I'm from Chile, and I wanted to ask because in Chile and other countries of the region, we've had an introduction to the e-bikes and the e-scooters in the last few years, and they've become a bit massive. And I wanted to ask you, how do you see Latin America in terms of micromobility? And what do you think are some urgent policies or measures that we should take to affront them?
100%. Latin America is, in fact, a global leader when it comes to smaller than car mobility, and that's because of powered two-wheelers, which are extremely popular, also extremely dangerous. So where do e-bikes fit in that? Well, you have a whole set of populations that are used to getting around cities with powered two-wheelers. E-bikes, whether they're capped at 25 kilometers an hour or capped at 45 kilometers, provide another choice, if you will. When they're capped at 25 kilometers an hour, they are a safer choice insofar as they're allowed to operate in environments that are safe for them. So going back to the infrastructure. But I think in Latin America, you are primed, I think is the right word, to better accept lighter than car, smaller than car mobility because of the prevalence of powered two-wheelers. Now, I think there is work to be done in making those two-wheelers electrified on the one hand, and accepting a new type of vehicle that isn't as high speed as a powered two-wheel motorcycle or moped, but that provides for most of the daily mobility needs. When we look around the world, and Santiago isn't very different, when we look at the distance, the number of trips per distance category, we see almost up to 60% of all trips are less than 8 kilometers in length. That's a huge amount of trips that could be done by e-bike, that are being done by powered two-wheelers, that if they're done by car would be a disaster. And so there is this thing, how can we incentivize the use of these lighter vehicles, electric vehicles, and build on this experience, if you will, acceptation of two-wheelers as being an option. And three-wheelers are also important, especially for cargo. So that's what I would say when we think about what is possible in Latin America.
Yeah, I'm David Zipper with MIT. Yeah, I'm just going to push you further, Philippe, on this question of like the fast and heavier micromobility vehicles, because as I know you're aware, there are these super fast often somewhat larger e-bikes that look a bit like mopeds, act a bit like mopeds. And and my question is, what specifically cities or local governments can do to ensure the safety of everybody else who is in a slower, smaller micromobility vehicle? Because simply saying, well, you can only go up to 25 miles or 40 kilometers, what have you, per hour on a vehicle in the bike lane sounds great, but there's no enforcement. And so when you mix these really fast vehicles with somebody who's maybe taking their young child for a ride, it just doesn't work. I've heard people complain about this in Amsterdam as well as where I live in Washington, D.C. So I'd love it if you could give some policy specifics on what you think is a best practice for vehicles like that.
So I think you said it in your question, that is enforcement. The rules are put into place, and you have a mix right now, and sometimes a confusing mix. And the Netherlands is a specific case where mopeds have, up until recently in urban areas, been able to use cycling infrastructure. So you had the possibility of using fast moped-like vehicles on cycling infrastructure. In other places, there is a clear distinction as to when powered two-wheelers can use infrastructure. And that is, when it's enforced, a good approach. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that there is speed limitations that can be put onto a specific part of infrastructure. So from a type of lane or special network for cycling or light mobility. And then there's speed restrictions that are put in entire zones where all users, cars, vans, trucks, all have to travel at either 30 kilometers an hour, at least when you have a 30-kilometer zone in Europe, and elsewhere, or a 20-kilometer zone, as you have in some places where these modes are set to act together. And a key factor in allowing those systems to be put into place is enforcement. And that's enforcement also for the lighter vehicles. So for the freight delivery that are taking place on these two-wheeler, three-wheeler vehicles, for the fast mopeds, fast e-scooters where they're allowed, and e-bikes, fast e-bikes where they're allowed. A difficult component of enforcement you also touched on, which is when these vehicles look very similar, how can you enforce, how can you be ready to discern which vehicles are the ones that could potentially travel faster? And that is something that I cannot think of any city and or country that has satisfactorily answered that. But it is a question, especially when it comes to homologation of vehicles, that is being asked. How do we make sure that they are not easy to confuse from an enforcement perspective, even when you don't look at the actual speed? The final thing I'll say is that we do enforce speeds for cars, not uniformly, but we do, and I think we just need to get up to the point where we're also enforcing speeds at least as much as we do for cars. But if you have to enforce speeds in an environment, then you must first enforce speeds on cars and vans and trucks, because as I said, they're the real source of the danger in the system.
So I'm Giles Bailey from Strategy Consulting in the UK. David kind of took part of my question, but I'd like to go into a little more detail on the conflict between classic cycling and e-scooters. And in your research, are you finding increasing evidence of conflict or accidents? And is that coming back to infrastructure or a more training issue or just the numbers? But really that conflict between classic cycling and e-scooters and the infrastructure that cities are currently providing.
We find no evidence of direct confrontation or conflicts between e-scooters and cyclists. What we do find is evidence of increased conflicts among all micromobility riders when infrastructure is too small and it is not size enough for the flows. And we see that when there's a huge or a significant uptick, as we saw after COVID in a lot of cities around the world, that there were these points in the network where there's incredible congestion that led to conflicts between cyclists and cyclists, that led to conflicts between cyclists and e-cyclists, and that led to conflicts between both of those and e-scooter users. And so it's not a question of, in terms of the conflicts, it's not a question of which mode, it's the question of having too many on too small a network. Going back to the piece about if you really want to favor these kind of beneficial modes of traveling, then you need to provide much more space than you have, reallocate space to those modes, and have perhaps even entire networks that are devoted, streets that are devoted to this type of lighter than car mobility. The last thing I'll say is that when it comes to specific issues relating to the vehicle itself, as I said, those tend to be more related to the infrastructure. So hitting a crack and having your front wheel diverted because it's too small and then flying over the handlebar of an e-scooter is a more classic scenario, or one that affects e-scooters more than a cyclist. But having a cyclist run into an e-scooter isn't something that's inherent with the e-scooter. It's just inherent with having too many people in too close a space.
Thank you. Perhaps we'll take one last question before we wrap up. Or yes, two then. Okay.
Hi.
We've
Hi.
got three. Okay. We've probably got
We've got
another
the room all day.
5 minutes.
Okay.
So let me.
Hi, I'm Max from Chile too, and I would like to ask you if you have if you have numbers about how much can decrease the risk of accidents when country puts its speed limits on scooters and e-bikes. If there's any down in the risk of accidents.
Yes. So we don't collect that data specifically, but we have reviewed, in the case of this study, all the published studies and some of the unpublished studies that are available from our members looking at the after intervention effect. So if this intervention was put into place, speed management, and if it was enforced, then what were the impacts on crashes? And what I can say is that the enforcement of speed limitations does decrease the number of serious injury and almost reduces the number of fatal crashes. What I can also point out, because some of these shared devices that are provided by commercial operators are able to receive signals or impose geo-fenced speed management themselves. So when they enter a zone, they automatically throttle down. And what we do see is a slight bit of evidence that when those speeds are too slow for e-scooters, the e-scooter becomes inherently unstable at 6 kilometers an hour. But what we clearly see from that evidence is the crashes that may result from that are going to be loss of control crashes at 6 kilometers an hour. It's really a crash as if you're walking quite fast, and the injuries are almost always, if there is an injury, very benign.
Okay. So we'll take just here, and then we'll have to wrap up. And maybe we can stay afterwards and answer any questions if there's any.
Je vais poser ma question en français, si vous permettez. Je m'appelle Youn Saouri, je suis journaliste marocain pour le magazine Tel Quel. Donc le Maroc a connu l'arrivée de l'investissement de pas mal d'entreprises internationales qui commercialisent des scooters électriques et des bicyclettes électriques, sauf qu'on ne dispose pas d'infrastructures pour réduire un peu le risque bien sûr d'accident pour ces usagers. On a eu une flambée de nombre d'usagers. Est-ce que vous ne pensez pas qu'il faut commencer par imposer au gouvernement le fait de mettre en place un arsenal, à la fois un arsenal juridique pour s'assurer de la sécurité de ses usagers, mais aussi des infrastructures dédiées avant bien sûr de permettre à ces entreprises d'investir dans ces marchés.
So I'll quickly resume the question for the audience. The question was, in Morocco, we've seen the arrival of shared commercial operators for e-scooters, I believe in particular, and in an environment where there is no dedicated infrastructure for these types of vehicles or for bicycles. And so the question was, it's a chicken and egg question. Should you invest first in the kind of safe infrastructure, for example, that we talked about, or do you wait after you've had a tremendous number of users asking for that infrastructure? Est-ce que vous comprenez l'anglais si je fais la... D'accord. So I'll give a dual response in French and English. Donc la première chose à dire, c'est que the first thing to say is that when we think about, quand nous pensons à propos de ce qui doit être fait en premier et après, what should first be done, what the order of these interventions should be, there is a school of thought that is basically summed up in the safety in numbers. Donc il y a une école de pensée qui parle de la sécurité routière par les nombres. When we've looked at this safety in numbers phenomena, the basic thinking is if you have a lot of people using a bicycle or using an e-scooter, then there is an automatic safety effect because that's what we see in the evidence. Alors quand on a la sécurité par le nombre, l'idée c'est que quand on a beaucoup d'usagers, que la sécurité qu'on voit dans les études qui s'améliore est l'effet du nombre. But we also saw another possibility, which is probably the more likely possibility, and that is you have numbers because of safety. Et donc il y a une autre possibilité qui est tout à fait possible, même probable selon nos études, c'est qu'on a le nombre à cause de la sécurité routière. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if you are going to introduce a lot of riders, as in the case of Morocco, alors ça veut dire que si dans le cas du Maroc, on va mettre en place, on va faciliter l'arrivée de ces services commerciaux de micromobilité partagée, on verra le nombre augmenter, on verra aussi le nombre d'accidents augmenter, parfois graves. What we'll see is that the number of micromobility users will increase, the number of crashes will increase, and probably the number of serious crashes will increase. So from what we have seen in the past, it is a better approach to introduce this progressively in areas that have safe infrastructure or that have controlled managed speeds of less than 30 kilometers an hour. And that is a primary decision that's linked to our approach to the safe system. Donc, ce qu'on peut dire, c'est que vu les études que nous avons faites dans le passé, vu cet effet de la sécurité, le nombre à cause de la sécurité, mieux vaut mettre en place dans les premières zones concernées, une réduction de la vitesse, automobile bien sûr, 30 km, et aussi la mise en place d'infrastructures dédiées. Et ensuite, parce qu'on a cette zone sécurisée, on verra le nombre augmenter. Il nous paraît, vu les données qu'on a vues de passer, c'est une meilleure façon d'éviter les accidents et les accidents graves. So from our perspective, that is a better ordering in a way that you avoid all the serious crashes and fatal crashes.
Thank you. And last question, and then we'll finish in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Hi, Osnat from The Marker in Israel. I wanted to ask about the number of the 26 reduction in risk, in casualty risk.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any kind of analyze that that separates countries who did a change in infrastructure and to countries who didn't, and what happened in countries that didn't?
So what we see from the data that was submitted by the operators, and this is operator-submitted data, that there are two factors. One are, three factors, in fact. The first is that countries, or cities rather, because this is never at the country level, that implemented infrastructure changes, reduced speed and provided infrastructure, or hardened infrastructure after COVID, did see an improvement in the safety performance. That doesn't mean that the crashes went down. In fact, the crashes may have gone up in several cities, but the number of riders went up at a steeper level. But the serious crashes and the fatal crashes certainly went down. The second thing is an experience effect that you see over time as more and more riders are not riding for the very first time an e-scooter, and talking about e-scooters here, then that plays. And you might have had a bump when these services arrived in cities with a high incidence of crashes at the outset, simply because people didn't have any experience riding these vehicles. And the last thing is linked to the vehicle design itself, as I said. The latest generation of shared e-scooters have larger wheels, have weight that's further down and further back, center of gravity is further back, and they also have wider platforms and separate braking front and back. And all of those factors lead to a decrease in the crash risk of e-scooters.
Thanks very much, Philippe. Thank you, everybody. You might have more questions, in which case we'll just maybe wrap it up and you can
we'll go ride some e-scooters outside. We can show you.
And just ask Philippe afterwards, after the press conference. But we'd like to thank you really for being here and for asking all your questions. And thank you for coming to the International Transport Forum Summit. We're very delighted that you're here. We hope you enjoyed the couple of days that we have here. We hope you meet very interesting people and go away with some new things to think about and to write about. And look forward to seeing you around for the next few days. Thank you. And as Philippe said, don't forget we have the next report coming out on the environmental aspects of micromobility as well, which will be out probably in the next month. Thank you very much.
Skip the other one back? Yeah. Oh, good. Great. Thanks so much.